History doesn't always end where the records stop. Sometimes it fractures, leaving behind silence where answers should be. Across deserts, oceans, and forgotten cities, we keep finding traces of something that doesn't quite fit. Objects out of time, messages no one can fully decode, events that defy explanation. What really happened in those missing chapters of human history? And why do some discoveries seem almost deliberately incomplete? Tonight, we follow the trail of the unexplained, where every clue raises more questions than it resolves. Step inside and decide for yourself what history never expected to reveal. Deep within the Sichuan Basin of southwestern China lies one of archaeology's most haunting discoveries: the ritual pits of the Sanxingdui archaeological site. Buried beneath layers of earth for more than 3 millennia, these pits do not resemble ordinary graves or storage sites. Instead, they feel deliberate, almost ceremonial, filled with objects that seem too strange, too sophisticated, and too symbolic to belong to a single, easily defined culture. When excavations began in the late 20th century, archaeologists expected traces of a conventional Bronze Age settlement tied to early Chinese civilization. What they uncovered instead disrupted every assumption. In 2 major sacrificial pits, thousands of artifacts emerged from the soil: bronze masks with oversized hollow eyes, elongated facial features unlike any known tradition, intricate ritual vessels, jade blades, ivory remnants, and fragments of what may have once been ceremonial trees cast in bronze. Why were these objects gathered and buried so carefully? And why were they intentionally destroyed before being interred? Mainstream interpretations suggest ritual offerings, perhaps acts of sacrifice meant to communicate with ancestral spirits or deities. The careful arrangement and the evidence of burning point toward controlled ceremonial destruction, a symbolic release rather than abandonment. In this view, the pits represent a moment of crisis or renewal, when a society deliberately buried its sacred objects to mark transition, appease higher forces, or reset its spiritual world. Yet the more the artifacts are studied, the more questions emerge. The faces of the bronze masks, for example, do not resemble typical representations found in contemporaneous Chinese cultures. Their exaggerated eyes and angular forms seem almost otherworldly, as if designed not merely to depict humans, but something beyond human perception. Some scholars suggest they may represent deities or shamanic figures seen during trance states. Others quietly note how little they resemble anything found elsewhere in Bronze Age Asia. Then there is the absence of writing. Despite the sophistication of the objects, no decipherable script has been recovered from Sanxingdui. How could a society capable of such advanced bronze casting leave behind no readable record? Was their writing perishable, lost to time? Or did they communicate knowledge in ways that left no linguistic trace at all? A further mystery lies in the abrupt disappearance of this culture. After flourishing for centuries, the Sanxingdui tradition seems to vanish or transform suddenly, eventually giving way to the nearby Jinsha site culture. Was this decline caused by environmental change, political upheaval, or integration into another expanding civilization? Or did the ritual burial itself mark the end of something far more complex than we currently understand? Beyond the official explanations, more speculative interpretations occasionally surface. Some suggest that Sanxingdui represents a highly isolated cultural development, evolving independently with its own symbolic system now lost to us. Others propose distant cultural contact, pointing to unusual artistic parallels found far outside China, though no conclusive evidence supports direct connection. There are even fringe ideas that treat the artifacts as expressions of visionary or mythic experiences encoded into bronze and jade, though such interpretations remain outside mainstream archaeology. What remains undeniable is the sheer strangeness of the site. Every object seems intentional, yet not fully understood. Every pit feels like a frozen moment of meaning that no longer translates cleanly into the present. Standing before these artifacts today in the Sanxingdui Museum, one cannot help but feel a quiet tension between knowledge and mystery. Glass cases preserve the bronzes, yet they do not explain them. Labels provide context, yet leave gaps where certainty should be. And so the question lingers, unchanged by decades of study. Were the ritual pits of Sanxingdui a sacred offering to forces we can still interpret? Or a message from a worldview so different from our own that we have not yet learned how to read it? As the investigation moves deeper into the ancient Mediterranean world, the narrative shifts away from well-mapped empires and into something far more uncertain, fragments of language that refuse to fully reveal themselves. In the coastal city of Byblos, Lebanon, time seems layered rather than linear, as if every wave that touches the shore carries echoes of something older than memory itself. Here, among the ruins and windswept stone, archaeologists uncovered something unexpected. Inscriptions that did not match any known writing system of the ancient Near East. Carved onto stone and metal tablets, the symbols appear orderly, deliberate, yet stubbornly unreadable. This is what scholars refer to as the Byblos Syllabary, or more broadly, the Byblos script. Dated roughly to the early 2nd millennium BC, these inscriptions emerge from a world that was already deeply interconnected through trade. Byblos was not an isolated settlement. It was a thriving maritime hub, exchanging goods, ideas, and perhaps even writing systems with neighboring cultures. Egyptian hieroglyphs, Mesopotamian cuneiform, and early Semitic traditions all flowed through its ports. And yet, amid this cultural convergence, the Byblos inscriptions stand apart, neither fully Egyptian nor clearly derived from known Semitic scripts. What makes the mystery more compelling is not only what is present, but what is missing. Unlike other ancient writing systems, there is no clear bilingual inscription, no Rosetta Stone to unlock its meaning. Scholars have identified recurring signs, patterns that suggest a syllabic structure, possibly representing sounds rather than ideas. But beyond that threshold, interpretation becomes uncertain. Some researchers suggest that the script may represent an experimental stage in the evolution of alphabetic writing, a transitional form between complex logographic systems and the simpler phonetic alphabets that would later transform communication across the ancient world. If true, these inscriptions could represent one of the earliest attempts to break language down into elemental sounds. Yet not all questions find consensus. Why does the script appear so localized, confined largely to Byblos and its immediate surroundings? Was it a failed writing system that never spread beyond its creators? Or could it have been used for a specific, perhaps sacred or administrative purpose that left little trace in the archaeological record? There are also more speculative interpretations, carefully kept at the margins of academic discussion. Some have wondered whether the script represents a deliberate cipher, designed to obscure meaning rather than transmit it openly. Others suggest it may preserve a ritual language, reserved for elite scribes or religious contexts, never intended for everyday communication. These ideas remain unproven, but they persist precisely because the evidence is incomplete. Even the material context raises questions. Some inscriptions appear on prestige objects, stone blocks, ceremonial items, while others are more modest. Does this variation indicate changing use over time, or different functions within society? And if the script was once widely understood, why did it disappear so completely from historical memory? Standing before these inscriptions today, one is left with a peculiar sense of proximity and distance at once. The symbols are visible, tangible, carved by human hands thousands of years ago, yet their meaning remains just out of reach. It is as if the past is speaking in a language that has lost its translator. And so the Byblos syllabary remains suspended between clarity and silence, a script that may represent innovation, experiment, or forgotten convention. Each carved sign feels like a question left intentionally unanswered, waiting for a reader who has not yet arrived. What kind of knowledge disappears so thoroughly that even its alphabet becomes unreadable? And how many other voices from antiquity still linger, written in systems we have not yet learned how to hear? Following the traces left in the stone of Byblos, Lebanon, where language itself seemed to hesitate between sound and silence, the story of ancient communication does not end. It drifts outward across the sea lanes of the ancient world. From the Levantine shores, trade routes stretched eastward, carried by winds and currents into the waters of the Persian Gulf, where another civilization once thrived in relative obscurity, yet played a vital role in connecting worlds. In the shimmering heat of what is now the region of Bahrain and the surrounding coasts of the Arabian Peninsula, archaeologists have traced the outlines of something both familiar and elusive: the Dilmun civilization. In ancient texts from Mesopotamia, Dilmun was described as a place of purity, a land where trade flourished and where ships arrived like clockwork across blue, salt-heavy waters. To the people of Sumer, it was almost mythologized, half trading partner, half distant paradise. But beneath these poetic references lies a more grounded and unsettling question. Where exactly were Dilmun's ports? Archaeological evidence suggests that key settlements and harbors once existed along the coastlines and islands of the Persian Gulf, including areas of modern Bahrain and parts of eastern Arabia. Stone anchors, trade seals, and remnants of dockside activity point to bustling maritime hubs that connected Mesopotamia with the Indus Valley and beyond. Goods such as copper, pearls, textiles, and ceramics moved through these waters, forming one of the earliest known international trade networks in human history. And yet, when modern researchers attempt to map these ports with precision, they encounter gaps, entire coastlines where expected infrastructure is absent, and ancient descriptions that do not align neatly with present geography. Some of the land that once hosted these harbors may now lie submerged beneath rising sea levels or buried under centuries of sediment. Others may have been erased by shifting shorelines, as the Gulf's waters slowly reshaped the edges of civilization itself. On islands such as Failaka Island, traces of ancient habitation hint at a broader network of maritime activity extending far beyond what survives today. But even here, the picture remains incomplete. Was this a centralized system of ports governed by a unified authority, or a loose constellation of trading stations, each adapting to the shifting demands of commerce and environment? Mainstream archaeological interpretations suggest that Dilmun's decline was gradual, influenced by environmental change, the silting of waterways, and the eventual redirection of trade routes. As Mesopotamian powers rose and fell, so too did the economic relevance of these Gulf ports. Over time, what was once a vibrant maritime corridor may have become quieter, its harbors slowly abandoned, its infrastructure reclaimed by wind and water. Yet there are still unanswered questions that linger at the edges of the record. Some researchers point to anomalies in settlement patterns, suggesting that certain ports may have been far more extensive than current excavations reveal. Others note that ancient texts describe harbor activity and prosperity that seem disproportionate to the relatively modest remains found so far. Is this a matter of incomplete excavation, or something more complex about how these sites were used and recorded? There are also more speculative interpretations, carefully situated outside mainstream consensus. Could some of these ports have been temporary, seasonal hubs rather than permanent settlements, appearing and disappearing with the rhythms of trade and tide? Or might coastal geography have shifted so dramatically over millennia that entire harbor complexes now lie hidden beneath the sea, waiting to be discovered by underwater archaeology that has only just begun to expand in scope? Standing at the modern shoreline, It is difficult to reconcile the quiet present with the idea of a once bustling maritime network stretching across the Gulf waters. The sea looks unchanged at first glance, endless, reflective, indifferent. And yet, beneath its surface, history may be layered in ways still not fully understood. If Dilmun truly served as a bridge between great ancient civilizations, then what else might still rest beneath these waters, waiting for the outlines of its ports to re-emerge from the silence? The story does not remain at the edge of the sea for long. From the quiet, submerged questions of Dilmun's vanished harbors, the narrative shifts inland, carried across deserts, trade corridors, and forgotten riverbeds, into a landscape where water becomes rare, and fire appears to take its place as the central language of ritual and survival. Far to the northeast, in the harsh expanse of what is now Turkmenistan, the desert seems at first glance empty, almost indifferent to human presence. Yet beneath its sands lies one of the most enigmatic urban complexes of the Bronze Age, Gonur Tepe, a central site of what archaeologists call the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex. Unlike the coastal ports of Dilmun, where life once revolved around tides and trade winds, Gonur Tepe appears shaped by control over something far more fragile here: water drawn from river systems that no longer flow as they once did. Mud brick walls, palace structures, and carefully planned drainage systems suggest a society that did not merely survive in the desert, it engineered its presence within it. But among the most striking discoveries are not the walls or the tombs. It is something smaller, more concentrated, and far more difficult to interpret: the fire installations scattered across ritual complexes, often described as altars, hearths, or sacred burning spaces. At first, they appear deceptively simple: circular or rectangular platforms, ash-filled basins, and carefully constructed enclosures that seem to have been designed to contain flame rather than fuel it. Some are found within larger temple-like structures, arranged with deliberate symmetry. Others appear in isolation, as if standing guard over spaces now lost to shifting sand. What purpose did these fires serve? Mainstream archaeological interpretations suggest a ritual function. Fire, in many ancient cultures, is not merely practical but symbolic, associated with purification, transformation, and communication with the divine. Within the broader cultural horizon of Central Asia during the 2nd millennium BC, some scholars have drawn cautious parallels to early forms of fire-centered worship that would later be seen in traditions such as those associated with ancient Iranian religious practices. Yet at Gonur Tepe, there is no single, fully readable textual system to confirm belief, doctrine, or ritual intent. Instead, there are objects, ash layers carefully maintained rather than discarded, repeated rebuilding of fire structures in the same locations, and architectural designs that seem to prioritize containment, visibility, and repetition. Fire here does not appear accidental. It appears organized. And still, the questions persist. Why do some of these fire installations show signs of long-term, controlled burning, while others appear to have been extinguished and sealed? Was this a single unified ritual system, or a layering of practices that changed over generations? And what exactly was being burned? Some evidence points toward plant material, oils, and organic substances that leave minimal trace. Other contexts suggest more complex offerings, possibly tied to seasonal cycles, agricultural transitions, or social ceremonies that marked time itself. Yet none of these explanations fully accounts for the consistency and architectural emphasis placed on fire across the site. It is here that interpretation begins to stretch slightly beyond certainty. Some researchers propose that Gonur Tepe's fire altars may reflect an early and localized tradition of sacred fire worship that later diffused across regions of Central Asia and the Iranian plateau. In this view, these installations are not isolated curiosities, but early expressions of a much larger spiritual concept. Fire as a living intermediary between human communities and forces beyond the visible world. Others remain more cautious. They suggest that labeling these structures as altars may impose meaning that is not fully supported by evidence. In this interpretation, the fire installations could have served multiple overlapping purposes: domestic, industrial, and ritual, depending on context. Fire, after all, is both a tool and a symbol, and ancient societies rarely separated the two in the way modern categories demand. Still, there are elements that resist simple classification. Certain rooms within Gonur Tepe's temple complexes contain repeated fire features arranged in patterns that do not align easily with household activity or basic metallurgy. These are spaces that feel curated, almost choreographed, as if fire itself was part of a larger spatial performance. And then there is silence, an absence that is often overlooked but deeply present. No written explanation survives from Gonur Tepe that directly describes these installations. No accompanying texts clarify whether these fires were eternal, seasonal, ancestral, or something else entirely. The site speaks through structure, not instruction. From the fire-lit chambers of Gonur Tepe, where flames once seemed to shape ritual space itself, the narrative moves further north and east, away from enclosed ceremonial architecture and into a far more expansive, almost intangible phenomenon. Here, instead of temples or cities, we encounter something that looks like movement itself, a horizon-wide circulation of ideas, materials, and technologies that briefly connected distant worlds, and then, just as suddenly, began to dissolve. Across the vast stretches of Siberia, the forest steppe zones of what is now southern Russia, and extending toward parts of Mongolia and northern China, archaeologists have identified a striking and short-lived archaeological horizon known as the Seima-Turbino phenomenon. Unlike Gonur Tepe, with its fixed architecture and ritual fire installations, Seima-Turbino leaves behind something far more portable, yet no less enigmatic: highly advanced bronze weaponry. Socketed spearheads, finely cast axes, and standardized projectile points appear suddenly across a vast geographic range, dating roughly to the early 2nd millennium BC. Even more puzzling is their consistency. These objects are not isolated inventions. They appear as if part of a shared technological vocabulary, spread rapidly across enormous distances. And then, just as quickly as they emerge in the archaeological record, they begin to disappear. What was the Seima-Turbino network? Some scholars describe it as a technological horizon rather than a single culture, a web of mobile metallurgists, traders, or warrior groups who carried advanced bronze casting techniques across Eurasia. The speed of this diffusion is what continues to challenge interpretation. In a world without roads, writing systems for coordination, or centralized empires spanning such distances, how did such uniform technology spread so widely, so quickly? The material evidence suggests movement on a scale that defies simple explanation. Metal types and casting techniques appear in regions separated by thousands of kilometers, from the Ural foothills to the Mongolian steppe. Yet there are no clear urban centers, no lasting administrative structures, and very few permanent settlements associated directly with this network. It is as if the technology traveled more effectively than the people who used it. Mainstream interpretations propose that this was driven by highly mobile groups of metalworkers operating along interconnected trade and migration routes. These groups may have specialized in bronze production, exchanging weapons and tools for raw materials such as copper and tin, which were unevenly distributed across the landscape. In this view, Seima-Turbino represents an early example of technological globalization, fragile, fast-moving, and dependent on unstable social networks. But this raises an immediate question. If the network was so efficient, why did it not stabilize into something more permanent? The collapse of the Seima-Turbino phenomenon is as striking as its emergence. After a relatively short period of activity, the distribution of its characteristic artifacts sharply declines. Regional metalworking traditions reassert themselves, and the distinctive shared style fades from the archaeological record. The network seems to dissolve not gradually, but abruptly. Some researchers attribute this disappearance to environmental pressures, climate fluctuations that disrupted migration routes, altered resource availability, or fragmented the fragile exchange systems that sustained long-distance metallurgy. Others point to shifting social landscapes. Emerging local powers may have absorbed or displaced the mobile craftspeople, integrating their knowledge into more localized traditions. Yet, there remain aspects that do not easily align with these explanations. For instance, the apparent uniformity of Seima-Turbino weapon designs suggests a level of coordination that is difficult to maintain across dispersed and mobile groups. Was this achieved through shared apprenticeship networks, seasonal gatherings, or itinerant master craftsmen who moved continuously between regions? And if so, why is there so little direct evidence of their camps, workshops, or resting points? There are also more speculative interpretations, carefully positioned at the edges of academic consensus. Some have suggested that the Seima-Turbino horizon may reflect not just trade or migration, but a rapid cascade of knowledge transfer triggered by a single technological breakthrough, possibly in metallurgy or casting techniques, that spread faster than cultural memory could stabilize it. Others propose that oral transmission networks, now entirely lost, once carried precise technical knowledge across immense distances with remarkable fidelity. From the fading traces of Seima-Turbino's vast and vanishing network, where knowledge seemed to move faster than the civilizations that carried it, the journey turns once again toward stillness, toward stone that does not travel, and architecture that appears to anchor itself in time rather than across space. In the heart of Upper Egypt, along the west bank of the Nile near modern Abydos, lies one of the most enigmatic monuments of the ancient world, the Osireion. At first glance, it is easy to miss. Unlike the towering temples that define the Egyptian landscape, this structure sits lower, heavier, almost submerged in its own architectural silence. Massive stone pillars rise from a water-filled trench, and limestone blocks form corridors that seem to descend rather than expand. It is a place that feels deliberately separated from the monumental language of surrounding dynastic temples, as if it belongs to a different architectural conversation entirely. Archaeologically, the Osireion is often associated with later constructions from the New Kingdom period, particularly linked to the reign of Seti I. In this interpretation, it functioned as a symbolic tomb or cenotaph, designed to represent mythological associations with Osiris, the god of rebirth and the underworld. The flooded chamber at its center, surrounded by massive megalithic blocks, is understood as a ritualized representation of the primordial waters from which creation emerged. And yet, even within this framework, the structure resists complete explanation. The most striking feature lies beneath the visible chamber, a network of subterranean passages and architectural elements that appear unusually massive, almost archaic in construction style compared to surrounding dynastic architecture. Some of the stonework is composed of enormous red granite blocks, cut and placed with a precision that raises persistent questions about construction techniques, logistical organization, and intended function. What purpose did these hidden chambers serve? Mainstream interpretations suggest that these lower levels were part of a symbolic cosmological design, a physical embodiment of ancient Egyptian beliefs about the cycle of death, resurrection, and the underworld journey of Osiris. In this view, the submerged chamber is not meant to be used in a practical sense, but experienced as myth-made stone. a descent into the conceptual origin of life itself. But archaeology often begins where symbolism ends, and questions remain in the details. Why does the construction of certain sections differ so markedly from other known structures of the same period? Why do some architectural elements appear older, or at least stylistically distinct, as if they were incorporated into a later design rather than built as part of a single coherent project? And what lies beyond the most accessible chambers, where water and sediment have made full excavation difficult? These uncertainties have given rise to alternative interpretations, carefully situated at the edge of mainstream Egyptology. Some researchers have suggested that the Osireion may have been constructed atop, or even integrated with, an earlier, now lost subterranean structure. In this view, the visible monument could represent a later cultural layer built over an older architectural foundation, whose origins remain unclear. Others have proposed that the submerged nature of the central chamber is not purely symbolic, but possibly tied to hydraulic or environmental conditions that once influenced the site more directly. Was water here always a symbolic element, or did it once play a more functional role in rituals, access, or architectural design? There are also more speculative ideas that circulate outside academic consensus. Some suggest that the Osireion preserves architectural knowledge from a far earlier and more advanced stage of construction history, later reinterpreted and repurposed by dynastic builders. These ideas remain unverified, yet they persist in part because the structure itself feels like a palimpsest, layers of intention, meaning, and construction that do not fully align into a single narrative. Even the experience of the site today contributes to its mystery. The subterranean chambers are often partially flooded, reflecting light in fractured patterns that obscure as much as they reveal. Standing at its edge, one does not simply observe architecture. One looks into a space that seems to resist clarity, as though it were never fully intended to be seen in its entirety. If this structure truly represents a symbolic descent into origins, then what does it mean that its own origins remain partially hidden beneath stone, water, and time? And how many other places, buried beneath layers of history, still hold chambers we have not yet learned how to enter, or even recognize? From the submerged symbolism of the Osireion, where architecture itself seems to descend into myth and uncertainty, the narrative shifts once again, this time away from monumental stone entirely, and toward something far more fragile. Not carved in granite, but shaped in mud brick, river sediment, and irrigation channels that once turned barren land into a cradle of settlement. Far to the east, in the arid crossroads between modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan, and extending into parts of eastern Iran, archaeologists have traced the outlines of a civilization that once flourished along the Helmand River system, known today as the Helmand civilization, or more broadly associated with the Bronze Age cultures of the Iranian plateau and its fringes. It existed in a landscape defined by extremes, river-fed fertility surrounded by vast, unforgiving desert. Among its most significant archaeological expressions is the site of Shari Sokhta, often called the Burnt City. Its name alone evokes both destruction and memory, yet the site itself tells a far more complex story. Spanning multiple phases of occupation beginning in the 3rd millennium BC, it reveals a densely organized urban center with advanced craft production, trade networks, and evidence of surprisingly sophisticated social structures. Here, life was not accidental. It was engineered through water management systems that allowed agriculture to flourish in an otherwise hostile environment. Streets, workshops, and residential quarters suggest a society that was both structured and highly specialized. Artifacts recovered from the site, ceramics, textiles, seal impressions, indicate long-distance trade connections stretching toward Mesopotamia, Central Asia, and the Indus Valley. And yet, despite this complexity, the civilization did not persist. By the end of the 2nd millennium BC, Shahari Sokta and related settlements along the Helmand system were largely abandoned. The city that once supported tens of thousands of inhabitants gradually fell silent. Mud brick walls eroded under wind and time, irrigation channels dried or shifted, and the dense urban fabric dissolved into scattered ruins. What happened to the Helmand civilization? Mainstream archaeological interpretations point toward environmental transformation as the primary factor. The Helmand River system, sensitive to climatic fluctuations, may have shifted course or diminished in reliability, undermining the agricultural foundation upon which the civilization depended. In such a fragile ecological balance, even small changes in rainfall or river flow could have triggered cascading consequences. Crop failure, economic disruption, and gradual migration away from urban centers. But the archaeological record does not present a single, uniform collapse layer. Instead, abandonment appears uneven, some districts fading earlier than others, certain craft traditions persisting longer than the urban core itself. This irregularity raises additional questions. Was this a sudden environmental rupture, or a prolonged process of adaptation and dispersal? Some scholars suggest that the Helmand civilization did not so much disappear as transform, with populations migrating into surrounding regions and integrating into emerging cultural systems across the Iranian plateau and beyond. In this view, its legacy is not erased, but redistributed, its people absorbed into later cultural horizons that carried fragments of its knowledge forward. Yet there are still gaps that resist easy resolution. Why do certain technological and artistic traditions appear to fade more abruptly than others? Why do some settlement layers suggest rapid evacuation, while others imply gradual decline? And why does the broader region, for a time, show reduced urban density following the abandonment of these riverine centers? These uncertainties have invited more speculative interpretations, carefully held at the edges of mainstream discourse. Some researchers have proposed that shifts in trade networks, possibly linked to broader systemic changes across Bronze Age Eurasia, may have disrupted the economic foundations of Helmand urban life more rapidly than environmental change alone would suggest. Others consider the possibility of compounded pressures, ecological stress combined with political fragmentation or external migration pressures from neighboring regions. Standing among the ruins of Shahari Sokta today, one is confronted not with sudden destruction, but with erosion of continuity. The city does not end, it fades. And so the question remains suspended in the dry air of the desert. Was this civilization undone by environmental change alone, or by a convergence of forces too complex to reconstruct fully from what remains? What else might still lie beneath the shifting sands of the Helmand Basin, waiting to reveal how a once thriving world gradually dissolved into silence? From the fading traces of the Helmand civilization, where entire urban systems seem to dissolve slowly into the desert wind rather than collapse in a single moment, the narrative shifts once more across the arid corridors of Central Asia. Here, the silence of abandonment takes on a different form, less like erosion and more like sudden absence. In the foothills of the Kopet Dagh Mountains, within modern-day Turkmenistan, lies the ancient site of Altyn-Depe. Once a thriving settlement of the Bronze Age, Altyn-Depe was not a minor outpost. It was a structured urban center with residential districts, workshops, and monumental architecture that speaks to a society organized around craft specialization, trade, and emerging social complexity. Archaeological layers reveal a settlement that developed over centuries, reaching its peak around the 3rd and 2nd millennium BC. Among its most striking discoveries are finely crafted figurines, seals, and architectural remains that suggest connections to broader cultural networks stretching across the ancient Near East and the Indus Valley region. Altyn-Depe was not isolated. It was part of a wider world of exchange, ideas, and movement. And yet, despite this integration, something unusual occurs in its final phase. The archaeological record does not show a slow, continuous decline. Instead, there is a noticeable reduction in occupation, followed by what appears to be a relatively rapid abandonment. Houses are left incomplete. Workshops cease activity. Streets that once carried the rhythm of daily life fall silent, not over generations, but within a comparatively narrow span of time. What caused this sudden emptying? Mainstream interpretations tend to emphasize environmental and economic factors. The fragile balance of agriculture in this region depended heavily on water management systems fed by mountain runoff and seasonal streams. A shift in climate patterns, reduced rainfall, altered river behavior, or gradual desertification could have undermined agricultural productivity. In such conditions, even well-organized urban centers would struggle to sustain their populations. Trade disruption is also considered a contributing factor. Altyn-Depe existed within a vast network of exchange routes linking Central Asia to Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley. If those routes shifted, due to political instability, resource depletion, or changing demand, the economic foundation of the settlement may have weakened rapidly. Yet the nature of abandonment here still invites deeper questions. Why do some structures appear to have been left in a state of partial use, as if occupation ceased abruptly rather than being carefully phased out? Why do certain areas show signs of continued maintenance while others are suddenly deserted? And why does the material culture seem to stop almost decisively, without a prolonged transitional phase of adaptation? These patterns have led some researchers to consider more complex scenarios. Perhaps Altyn-Depe did not experience a single cause of decline, but a convergence of pressures that reached a tipping point, environmental stress combined with shifts in trade dynamics and social reorganization. In such a scenario, abandonment could appear sudden in the archaeological record, even if it unfolded over a relatively short but intense period of instability. Other, more speculative interpretations exist at the margins of discussion. Some suggest that population movement may have been driven not only by environmental necessity, but by broader regional realignments, where communities relocated en masse toward more stable centers, leaving behind settlements that were no longer viable within emerging economic systems. In this view, Altyn-Depe's emptiness is not collapse, but relocation. There are also broader questions about perception itself. How do we distinguish between a city that was abandoned and one that was gradually transformed into something archaeologically invisible? Could populations have shifted toward less permanent or more mobile forms of settlement, leaving fewer traces behind than expected? Standing among the remains of Altyn-Depe today, what remains is not devastation in the dramatic sense, but absence in its quietest form. Walls still stand in outline, but life has withdrawn. The structures remain, but their purpose feels suspended. And so the question lingers in the still air of the Kopet Dağ foothills. Was Altyn-Depe emptied by a single decisive turning point, or did it cross a threshold where continuation simply became impossible to see? What other ancient cities might appear silent not because they were destroyed, but because their people left in a way we have not yet learned how to recognize? From the quiet abandonment of Altyn-Depe, where entire neighborhoods seem to have fallen silent almost without warning, the narrative does not settle. Instead, it moves outward again, following older, wider currents that once connected distant highlands, valleys, and river corridors across the ancient Near East and the Caucasus. Long before many of these Bronze Age cities reached their peak, a cultural horizon had already begun to spread across a vast and varied landscape, stretching from eastern Anatolia through the South Caucasus and into northwestern Iran. Archaeologists refer to it as the Kura-Araxes culture. It was not a centralized state or empire in the traditional sense, but rather a shared material tradition, recognizable through its distinctive pottery, settlement patterns, and metalworking techniques. its signature black burnished ceramics, often with red interiors, appear across thousands of sites. Small agricultural villages, hilltop settlements, and seasonal camps all seem to reflect variations of a common cultural language. In many ways, it represents one of the earliest examples of large-scale cultural diffusion in the ancient world, an expansion not of armies or administrations, but of practices, styles, and ways of living. And then, at a certain point in the archaeological record, something shifts. The widespread distribution of Kura-Araxes material culture begins to fragment. The once consistent ceramic traditions become more localized. Settlement patterns change. In some regions, sites are abandoned. In others, new cultural influences begin to dominate. The expansive horizon that once seemed to stretch continuously across geography begins to break into discontinuous regional identities. What happened to the Kura-Araxes expansion? Mainstream archaeological interpretations suggest that this was not a sudden disappearance, but a gradual transformation. As communities migrated into new ecological zones, into Anatolia, the Levantine highlands, and parts of Mesopotamia, they encountered different environments, resources, and neighboring societies. Over time, the shared material culture that once defined their identity began to adapt, merge, and diversify. The expansion did not vanish. It dissolved into new cultural forms. Climate variability is also considered a contributing factor. Shifts in rainfall patterns and temperature may have altered agricultural viability in certain regions, encouraging mobility and fragmentation. In this view, the Kura-Araxes horizon represents a flexible, mobile adaptation to environmental uncertainty, rather than a fixed civilization destined to endure unchanged. But even within this framework, certain questions remain unsettled. Why does the archaeological footprint appear so extensive and yet so relatively uniform across such diverse terrains? How did shared traditions persist across long distances without clear evidence of centralized coordination? And why does the later record show such a pronounced cultural diversification, as if a previously connected system suddenly lost its internal coherence? Some researchers suggest that the expansion may have functioned more like a network of interacting communities than a single cultural identity. Shared technologies, especially in metallurgy and pottery production, could have spread through seasonal movement, intermarriage, or long-distance exchange routes. In this interpretation, fragmentation is not collapse, but the natural outcome of a system built on mobility and adaptation. Other, more speculative perspectives propose that the Kura-Araxes horizon may represent waves of migration driven by pressures that left little direct archaeological trace. In this view, its disappearance is not a loss, but a transformation into other cultural systems that absorbed and re-expressed its material traditions in new forms. The question then becomes not where it went, but how much of it still survives under different names, in different archaeological layers. There are also broader uncertainties that continue to shape discussion. The sheer scale of its expansion, reaching across mountains, valleys, and river systems, suggests levels of connectivity that are still not fully understood for the early Bronze Age. Was this movement gradual and continuous, or episodic and wave-like? And what mechanisms sustained its shared material identity across such vast and varied landscapes? Standing within the scattered remains of this horizon today, what remains is not a vanished civilization, but a fading pattern, one that becomes harder to trace the further it spreads. The pottery survives. The settlements remain. But the coherence that once linked them feels increasingly distant. And so the question lingers. Was the Kura-Araxes expansion something that ended, or something that slowly changed shape until it no longer appears as a single story in the archaeological record? From the fading cultural threads of the Kura-Araxes culture, A world once defined by movement, exchange, and shared material identity across vast and shifting landscapes, the narrative turns once again toward the edges of geography and preservation itself. Because sometimes, the deepest mysteries are not found in disappearance alone, but in what time chooses to preserve too well. Far to the east, on the fringes of the Taklamakan Desert within modern-day China, lies a burial ground that seems almost impossible to exist in such a harsh environment. This is the Xiaohe Cemetery, sometimes called the Small River Cemetery. It rests in a landscape of shifting dunes and wind-carved silence, where preservation is not expected. Yet paradoxically, it is exactly what the desert has granted. At first approach, the site appears almost surreal. Wooden posts shaped like oars rise from the sand, marking graves beneath elongated, boat-like coffins. Human remains, wrapped in layers of leather, textiles, and felt, are preserved with an unusual degree of detail thanks to the arid conditions. Even hair, clothing, and facial features have survived across millennia, suspended in a state that feels less like decay and more like pause. And yet, what makes Xiaohe truly enigmatic is not just its preservation, but its identity. The burials do not conform neatly to a single cultural or ethnic pattern, as understood through conventional archaeological classification. The physical characteristics of the remains, combined with textile styles, burial practices, and grave goods, suggest a blend of influences that do not map cleanly onto any one known ancient population of the region. Instead, Xiaohe appears as a convergence point, where multiple traditions intersect, overlap, and then vanish into the desert. Who were these people? Mainstream archaeological interpretations propose that Xiaohe represents a Bronze Age population connected to broader Indo-European-related migration patterns, interacting with pastoral and oasis-based cultures across Central Asia. The boat-shaped coffins, for example, are often interpreted symbolically, as representations of passage, journey, or transition into the afterlife. The wooden markers rising above the sand may have served both practical and ritual functions, helping locate graves in a shifting landscape. But even within this framework, uncertainty remains. Why are the burial customs so distinctive, yet so internally consistent across hundreds of graves? Why does the material culture show both local adaptation and distant stylistic echoes that suggest contact with far-flung regions? And perhaps most intriguingly, why does Xiaohe appear so isolated in the archaeological record, so fully formed, yet so difficult to trace back to a clearly defined origin point? Some researchers suggest that Xiaohe may represent a highly mobile pastoral society that moved seasonally across vast territories, leaving behind only temporary footprints of settlement. In this view, the cemetery is not an isolated anomaly, but a rare moment of permanence within a largely nomadic existence, a place where a traveling culture paused long enough to leave a lasting record of its presence. Other interpretations, more speculative in nature, consider the possibility that Xiaohe reflects a convergence of multiple migrating groups, each contributing elements of burial practice, textile tradition, and symbolic expression. Over time, these influences may have fused into a unique local tradition that existed only briefly before dispersing or transforming into other cultural forms. There are also broader questions that arise from the cemetery's isolation. Why does such a richly preserved site appear in a region that otherwise yields so few comparable burial grounds from the same period? Was Xiaohe part of a wider network of desert-edge communities that have yet to be discovered beneath the shifting sands of the Taklamakan? Or is it a rare exception, a single surviving fragment of a much larger cultural landscape now erased by time and wind? Even the symbolism of the site resists simple reading. The elongated coffins, the upright wooden posts, the careful orientation of the graves, all suggest meaning layered beyond practical necessity. Yet without written records, those meanings remain suspended, readable only through inference, pattern, and absence. Standing among the dunes today, the cemetery feels less like a collection of graves and more like a frozen moment, an entire community held in silence by the desert itself. The wind still moves across the wooden markers, slowly reshaping the landscape around them, but the dead remain exactly where they were placed thousands of years ago. And so the question lingers in the shifting sand. Was Xiaohe a single isolated community preserved by extraordinary chance, or one surviving echo of a much larger world of desert cultures that has yet to be fully uncovered beneath the Taklamakan's endless dunes? From the silent dunes surrounding the Xiaohe cemetery, where entire lives have been preserved in an almost impossible stillness, as if time itself briefly stopped working, the narrative moves once again toward the edges of another desert world. But this time, the mystery is not only what was left behind, it is what was written and then hidden. Across the arid landscapes of modern-day Oman, particularly within regions shaped by ancient copper-bearing mountains and dry wadi systems, archaeologists have uncovered traces of one of the Bronze Age's most intriguing economic networks. Here, in settlements linked to the broader cultural sphere often referred to as the Magan civilization in Mesopotamian texts, copper was not just a resource, it was the foundation of identity, exchange, and survival. Slag heaps, smelting sites, and mining remnants suggest a landscape deeply shaped by metallurgy. Copper ore was extracted from mountainous regions, processed in rudimentary furnaces, and transported across trade routes that connected the Arabian Peninsula with Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley. In ancient written records from Mesopotamia, this land, Magan, is described as a vital supplier of copper, a place whose wealth was measured not in cities alone, but in the metal it could produce. And yet, within this industrial and commercial landscape, a far more enigmatic idea occasionally surfaces in archaeological and interpretive discussions. References to inscribed copper objects that do not fully align with known writing traditions of the period. Unlike the well-documented cuneiform tablets of Mesopotamia or the seals of the Indus Valley, these copper inscriptions, sometimes described in fragments, sometimes inferred through contextual evidence, do not form a clearly deciphered corpus. Instead, they exist at the margins of certainty, marks, symbols, and potential proto-writing systems etched into or associated with copper artifacts that suggest communication beyond simple trade labeling. What were these inscriptions meant to record? Mainstream interpretations tend to approach such findings cautiously. In many cases, markings on copper objects are understood as practical, ownership indicators, weight or trade notations, or workshop signatures. In a Bronze Age world where copper was a strategic commodity, even simple identification marks could carry significant economic meaning. But the idea of more structured symbolic systems embedded within Oman's copper trade network raises further questions. Could there have been a standardized form of notation used by miners, smelters, or traders, one that was never fully formalized into a written language? Or were these marks part of a broader but still poorly understood administrative system, one that operated alongside spoken agreements and oral contracts across long-distance trade routes? Some researchers suggest that the complexity of Bronze Age trade in the region may have required more sophisticated record-keeping than currently visible in the archaeological record. In this view, what survives today may represent only the most durable fragments of a once broader communicative system, one that may have included perishable materials, oral transmission, and symbolic shorthand now lost to time. There are also more speculative interpretations that occasionally emerge at the edges of academic discussion. Some propose that copper objects may have carried ritual or symbolic inscriptions tied not only to commerce, but to identity, authority, or religious practice within mining communities. In this sense, copper would not only have been a traded resource, but also a medium of meaning, its inscriptions acting as markers of belonging or sacred significance. Yet the evidence remains fragmented. No unified copper scrolls tradition has been fully identified or deciphered in Bronze Age Oman, and much of what is discussed remains interpretive, reconstructed from partial finds and broader regional comparisons. Still, the idea persists precisely because of what is missing: a complete system of understanding that would tie these fragments into a coherent narrative. Even the geography itself seems to echo the mystery. The mountains that once yielded copper are harsh and quiet today, their ancient mines reduced to scars in stone. The trade routes that once carried metal across deserts and seas have long since dissolved into shifting sands and changing coastlines. And yet the material remains: slag, tools, and inscribed fragments continue to surface, as if the system that created them has not fully vanished, but only broken into pieces too widely scattered to reassemble. From the copper-bearing mountains of ancient Oman, where trade, extraction, and fragile systems of meaning may once have been etched into metal itself, the narrative shifts again, this time moving northwest, back toward the contested edges of the ancient Near East, where desert winds erase settlements as easily as they reveal them. In northern Syria, within the arid plains near the modern borderlands of the Euphrates Basin, lies the archaeological site of al-Marra. Today, it appears as a low, wind-swept mound, an unremarkable rise in the landscape that gives little indication of the complexity once buried beneath it. But beneath the soil, excavations have revealed the remains of a fortified settlement dating back to the early Bronze Age, around the 3rd millennium BC. Stone foundations outline what once may have been defensive walls, administrative buildings, and domestic structures. Pottery fragments, seal impressions, and burial contexts suggest a community that was integrated into the broader cultural and political networks of ancient Syria and Mesopotamia. At first glance, al-Marra appears to fit within a familiar pattern, a small but strategically positioned settlement shaped by regional trade and interaction. And yet, certain discoveries at the site introduce a quieter but more persistent sense of uncertainty. Among the most discussed finds are unusual burial contexts beneath the settlement's structures, graves that appear carefully arranged, sometimes containing multiple individuals, and in some cases accompanied by artifacts whose symbolic meaning remains open to interpretation. The positioning of these burials beneath architectural layers suggests a deliberate integration of the dead into the physical foundation of the living space above. What kind of society builds its homes directly over the resting places of its dead in such a structured way? Mainstream archaeological interpretations suggest that these practices reflect ancestral veneration, a worldview in which the dead remain actively present within the social and spiritual fabric of the community. In this interpretation, the fortress is not simply a defensive structure, but a layered space where life and death are continuously intertwined. The buried individuals may have been founding ancestors, elite members of society, or figures granted special ritual significance. But even within this framework, questions remain unresolved. Why do some burial arrangements differ so markedly from others within the same site? Why are certain graves marked with objects that do not clearly correspond to known ritual categories of the period? And why does the architectural layout of the settlement appear to shift over time in ways that suggest changes in social organization that are not fully explained by external influences alone? These uncertainties have led to broader interpretive discussions. Some researchers propose that al-Marra functioned not only as a fortified settlement, but also as a ritualized landscape, a place where political authority, ancestral memory, and urban life were deliberately fused into a single spatial system. In this view, the fortress becomes more than a defensive structure. It becomes a physical manifestation of lineage, power, and continuity across generations. Others, working more cautiously, suggest that the burial complexity may reflect overlapping phases of occupation. Over time, the site may have been reused, rebuilt, and reinterpreted by successive groups, each adding new layers of meaning to older structures. What appears as a unified design today may in fact be the result of centuries of incremental transformation. There are also more speculative ideas, carefully kept at the edges of academic consensus. Some suggest that the unusual burial patterns could indicate a community in transition, one adapting rapidly to shifting regional dynamics in the early Bronze Age, where political fragmentation and migration may have forced new forms of social organization and ritual practice. In such a context, the fortress might represent not stability, but adaptation under pressure. Yet despite these interpretations, the site retains an atmosphere of unresolved depth. The more it is excavated, the more it seems to suggest that its story is not contained in any single layer. The architecture, the burials, and the artifacts do not form a single narrative line. They overlap, interrupt, and occasionally contradict one another. Standing at the edge of al-Marra today, what remains is not the image of a simple fortress, but something more ambiguous. A place where the boundary between domestic life, political authority, and ancestral presence appears unusually thin. And so the question lingers beneath the silence of the northern Syrian plains. Was al-Marra a fortress built to defend a city, or a carefully constructed landscape where the living and the dead were meant to coexist in ways we are only beginning to understand? From the layered burials beneath the al-Marra fortress, where life and death seem deliberately interwoven into the same architectural fabric, the narrative moves once more toward the open edges of the desert. Here, continuity itself begins to thin, replaced by traces of industry, smoke, slag, and stone, shaped not for dwelling, but for transformation. Stretching along the deep rift valley between modern-day Jordan and southern Israel lies the arid depression known as the Arabah Desert. Today, it appears as a harsh, mineral-rich corridor of rock and sand, but beneath its surface lies evidence of one of the most important early metallurgical landscapes in the ancient Near East. Here, copper was not simply extracted. It was forged into a system of production that shaped regional economies during the Bronze Age. Archaeological surveys have revealed ancient mining shafts, smelting installations, and slag heaps scattered across the desert floor. Together, they point to a landscape once alive with industrial activity, where ore was transformed into metal through controlled fire, labor, and knowledge passed across generations. These are the so-called copper workshops of the Arabah, sites associated with early phases of large-scale copper production, often linked to broader networks that connected the Levant with Egypt, Arabia, and Mesopotamia during the 2nd millennium BC. At first glance, the pattern seems straightforward. Mining communities extracted ore from rich deposits, transported it to desert smelting camps, and produced ingots for regional trade. The archaeological remains support this interpretation. Furnaces, tuyères, and slag deposits suggest repeated cycles of smelting activity, organized in ways that imply coordination rather than isolated effort. And yet, when these sites are viewed together, a quieter question begins to emerge. Many of the workshops appear to have been used intensely for a relatively short period, followed by abrupt abandonment. Some show evidence of planned production, structured layouts, standardized furnace designs, and organized waste disposal, while others seem to have been left mid-operation, as if activity ceased before completion. Why would such an essential industrial network fade so suddenly? Mainstream interpretations point toward shifts in trade routes and political control. Copper production in the Arabah was closely tied to regional demand, particularly from emerging states and urban centers. If those demand networks shifted, due to economic change, political instability, or the rise of alternative sources, production in the desert could have become unsustainable. In such a scenario, workshops would not collapse in dramatic fashion, but gradually lose purpose. Environmental factors also play a role in interpretation. Smelting copper in desert conditions required large amounts of fuel, particularly charcoal. Over time, deforestation in surrounding regions may have made fuel increasingly scarce, forcing communities to relocate or reduce production. Water access, labor organization, and transport logistics would all have been sensitive to such ecological pressures. But even within these explanations, certain details remain difficult to fully resolve. Why do some workshop clusters appear highly organized, while others are scattered and irregular, as if different groups with varying levels of technical knowledge were operating in the same region? Why do some smelting sites show signs of standardized production techniques, while nearby installations seem experimental or short-lived? These inconsistencies have led to broader interpretive possibilities. Some researchers suggest that the Arabah Desert may have hosted a shifting mosaic of specialized groups, miners, smelters, and traders, who moved seasonally or in response to fluctuating resource availability. In this view, the lost workshops are not evidence of collapse, but of mobility. Production sites that appeared, operated for a time, and then dissolved as communities relocated. Other, more speculative interpretations consider the possibility that copper production in the Arabah was not a single unified system, but a series of overlapping technological traditions. Different communities may have developed distinct smelting techniques, some of which left more visible archaeological traces than others. What we see today may be only the most durable fragments of a far more complex industrial landscape. And then there is the silence that follows the last slag heap, the absence of continuous occupation, the empty desert corridors where industry once burned at high temperatures against an otherwise still landscape. And so the question remains suspended in the heat above the desert floor. Were the copper workshops of the Arabah abandoned because their purpose ended, or because the networks that sustained them shifted into forms we have not yet fully recognized in the archaeological record? From the scorched workshops of the Arabah Desert, where copper once moved through fire, smoke, and carefully controlled destruction, the narrative shifts again, away from the horizontal scars of industry and toward something vertical, almost defiant against the flatness of the landscape. Because sometimes, in the ancient world, the most enduring mysteries are not what was extracted from the earth, but what was raised above it. Far to the northeast, in the broad river-fed depressions of what is now Bactria, archaeologists have encountered traces of an ancient Oasis civilization that once flourished along the edges of desert and mountain. This region, part of the wider cultural sphere often associated with the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex, was not a single unified state, but a constellation of settlements sustained by irrigation, trade, and careful adaptation to an unforgiving environment. Among its most striking and least understood features are the so-called towers, monumental mud brick structures found at various oasis sites, rising from the earth in layered geometric forms that still challenge simple categorization. At sites such as Dashley and surrounding areas, excavations have revealed circular and rectangular complexes, some enclosed by thick walls, others featuring central platforms or elevated architectural cores. From a distance, these structures do not resemble typical domestic architecture. They appear heavier, more deliberate, built with a sense of permanence that contrasts sharply with the fragile oasis environment around them. What were these towers meant to be? Mainstream archaeological interpretations approach them cautiously. Many scholars suggest that these structures served a combination of administrative, ritual, and defensive functions. In a landscape where water sources defined survival, control over irrigation and agricultural surplus would have required centralized organization. The towers may have functioned as storage facilities, ceremonial centers, or symbols of authority embedded within oasis communities. Their construction, thick walls, limited entry points, and elevated platforms, supports the idea of controlled access and oversight. In this view, they are not isolated monuments, but part of a broader system of Oasis management, where architecture reflected both practical necessity and emerging social hierarchy. And yet, even within this framework, the towers resist full clarity. Why do some of them appear isolated from surrounding domestic areas, as if standing slightly apart from everyday life? Why do certain structures show repeated phases of reconstruction, suggesting long-term ritual or symbolic importance beyond simple utility? And why does their architectural style vary so significantly across relatively small geographic distances? These questions have led some researchers to propose more layered interpretations. One possibility is that the towers represent a hybrid architectural tradition, structures that combined administrative control with ritual significance, blurring the boundary between governance and belief. In this reading, the towers are not simply functional buildings, but physical expressions of authority, where power was made visible through height, mass, and permanence in a landscape otherwise defined by scarcity and impermanence. Other interpretations focus on their possible role within broader trade networks. Bactria was situated along routes that would later become part of long-distance exchange systems connecting Central Asia with the Iranian Plateau, the Indus Valley, and beyond. Could these towers have served as nodes of coordination, places where goods were stored, recorded, or redistributed across seasonal networks of movement? And then there are more speculative ideas, carefully positioned at the edge of academic consensus. Some suggest that the towers may reflect a ritualized understanding of landscape itself, structures designed not only to organize society, but to mark sacred or cosmological points within the Oasis environment. In this view, height becomes symbolic, a way of anchoring human presence between earth and sky in a world where survival depended on invisible systems of water beneath the surface. Yet despite these interpretations, no single explanation fully resolves their purpose. The towers remain partially legible, recognizable in form, but elusive in function. Standing among the ruins of the Bactria oases today, what remains is not a skyline, but fragments of vertical intention. Walls that once rose with purpose now dissolve into earth-toned outlines, blending back into the landscape they once dominated. And so the question lingers in the dry air of Central Asia. Were these towers built to control the oasis, to represent authority, or to express something deeper about how ancient communities understood their place in a fragile and shifting world? From the elevated structures of ancient Bactria, where mud-brick towers once rose above fragile oasis systems like markers of authority, ritual, or survival, the narrative shifts once more, this time downward, away from what was built in open air and into what lies hidden beneath water. In the vast expanse of modern-day Lake Turkana, the landscape appears deceptively still. Its shimmering surface stretches across volcanic terrain, surrounded by arid plains and ancient geological formations. Today, it is often described as one of the most important regions for understanding early human evolution. But beneath its waters, and along its submerged shorelines, archaeologists have uncovered something far more unexpected than fossils alone. Scattered across the lakebed and its fluctuating edges are formations that appear, at first glance, almost geometric. Circular arrangements of stone, partial rings, and aligned boulders rest beneath layers of sediment and water, their origins obscured by shifting lake levels and the passage of time. These are the so-called stone circles beneath Lake Turkana. Unlike well-known megalithic sites that stand clearly above ground, these structures are partially submerged, intermittently visible depending on seasonal changes and water fluctuations. Their full extent remains difficult to map, as the lake's environment is dynamic, rising, retreating, and reshaping the shoreline over decades and centuries. What were these stone circles intended for? mainstream archaeological interpretations approach them with caution. Some researchers suggest that they may represent remnants of ancient shoreline activity, structures built when water levels were significantly lower, during periods when early communities lived closer to now submerged landscapes. In this view, the circles could have served practical purposes: markers of territory, fishing installations, or even foundations for temporary shelters that were later engulfed by rising waters. Other interpretations consider ceremonial or social functions. In many early societies, circular stone arrangements are associated with gathering spaces, locations for ritual, communal decision-making, or seasonal observances tied to environmental cycles. If early human groups inhabited the Lake Turkana basin during fluctuating climatic periods, these structures might reflect attempts to anchor meaning in an environment that was itself constantly changing. And yet, the ambiguity persists. Why do some of these stone arrangements appear deliberately constructed with consistent spacing and alignment, while others seem more irregular, as if shaped by different hands or different moments in time? Why are some partially preserved in clusters, while others are isolated, half lost beneath sediment and water? These inconsistencies have led to broader interpretive questions. Some researchers propose that the stone circles may represent multiple phases of human occupation across drastically different environmental conditions. Lake Turkana has experienced significant changes in water level over millennia, expanding and contracting in ways that would have repeatedly reshaped the surrounding landscape. In this scenario, what we see today may be a palimpsest of human activity, layers of habitation and ritual space built, abandoned, and submerged across long stretches of time. Other, more speculative interpretations consider whether these structures might reflect early forms of symbolic landscape marking, attempts by prehistoric communities to define space in relation to water, migration routes, or seasonal movement patterns. In such a reading, the circles are not isolated structures, but part of a wider cognitive mapping of the environment, where stone becomes a way of making the invisible visible. There is also the challenge of interpretation itself. Because many of these formations lie underwater or in unstable sediment zones, excavation is limited. What appears as deliberate geometry from aerial or sonar imaging may shift in meaning upon closer inspection, or remain frustratingly incomplete. And so uncertainty remains embedded not only in the structures, but in the act of seeing them at all. Standing at the edge of Lake Turkana today, it is difficult to distinguish between natural formation and human intention. The lake's surface reflects light, wind, and sky, but beneath that reflection lies a quieter question, one that resists resolution. Are these stone circles the remnants of ancient shoreline life slowly swallowed by a changing climate, or traces of a far older human impulse to organize space in ways we are only beginning to recognize? From the submerged stone circles of Lake Turkana, where human intention seems partially preserved, partially erased by shifting water and time, the narrative moves once again across continents. From Africa's deep past, we turn eastward, toward a desert civilization that mastered something equally essential: water itself, not as abundance, but as something carefully stored, measured, and protected. In the arid expanses of modern-day India, within the ancient settlement of Dholavira, lies one of the most sophisticated urban centers of the Bronze Age world. Part of the broader Indus Valley civilization, Dholavira stands apart for its extraordinary mastery of water management. Built on the island of Kadir in the Rann of Kutch, it was a city shaped by scarcity, where survival depended on engineering precision rather than environmental generosity. Massive reservoirs, stepped channels, and carefully carved stone conduits reveal a settlement designed to capture and store seasonal water. Every architectural element seems calibrated to the rhythm of rainfall, evaporation, and desert winds. But among these systems lies one of the site's most intriguing and least understood features: a series of deep, carefully constructed shafts, sometimes referred to as ritual shafts. These vertical, stone-lined structures descend into the earth in controlled, deliberate forms. Unlike simple wells or drainage features, they do not always align neatly with obvious practical functions. Some are integrated into public spaces, others appear in more restricted or architecturally significant areas of the city. Their depth, precision, and placement suggest intention beyond mere utility. What were these shafts meant for? Mainstream archaeological interpretations approach them cautiously. Some researchers suggest that they may have served multiple roles simultaneously, part water management, part storage, and possibly part ceremonial function. In a city where water was life, the act of accessing, controlling, and storing it may have carried not only practical importance, but also symbolic weight. Descending into the earth to reach water could itself have been a meaningful act, linking survival with ritual. Others propose that these shafts were integral to Dholavira's advanced hydraulic system, functioning as monitoring points, pressure regulators, or access wells for maintaining subterranean water flow. In this interpretation, what appears ritualistic may simply reflect a level of engineering complexity that is not immediately obvious without full reconstruction of the system. Yet even within these explanations, uncertainties remain. Why do some shafts appear to be placed in architecturally significant zones that are not clearly tied to water distribution? Why do certain structures show signs of careful maintenance or modification over time, as if their function evolved or was reinterpreted across generations? And why does the spatial arrangement of some of these features seem to echo patterns found in other ritualized architectural systems across ancient civilizations? These questions have led some scholars to consider broader interpretive possibilities. One perspective suggests that in Dholavira, the boundary between engineering and ritual was never clearly separated. Water, being both scarce and essential, may have carried inherent symbolic meaning. Accessing it through deep shafts could have been both a practical necessity and a structured social or ceremonial act, where technology and belief were intertwined rather than distinct categories. Other, more speculative interpretations propose that these shafts might reflect an early form of cosmological architecture, where vertical movement, descending into the earth and ascending back to the surface, mirrored conceptual ideas about cycles of life, renewal, and balance between surface life and subterranean sources. In such a reading, the city itself becomes a diagram of survival and meaning embedded into the landscape. And yet, despite extensive excavation and study, no single interpretation fully resolves their purpose. The shafts remain partially legible, clearly intentional, precisely built, but open in meaning. Standing within the ruins of Dholavira today, one is struck not only by what was built, but by how carefully it was organized around something invisible. Water moving beneath stone, seasonality shaping architecture, survival encoded into geometry. And so the question remains, echoing through the dry channels and empty reservoirs, were the ritual shafts of Dholavira purely engineering solutions to scarcity? Or did they also represent something deeper? An attempt to give meaning to the hidden systems that made life possible in one of the harshest landscapes of the ancient world. From the vertical silence of the ritual shafts at Dholavira, where descent into the earth seems to mirror a descent into meaning itself, the narrative shifts once again across water, sand, and time. The search moves back toward the ancient maritime edges of the Gulf, where trade, settlement, and abandonment once unfolded along shifting coastlines. Off the eastern coast of modern-day Kuwait lies Failaka Island, a place where layers of history overlap in ways that are still not fully untangled. Known in antiquity for its strategic position along Gulf trade routes, Failaka was once a thriving point of contact between Mesopotamian, Arabian, and later Hellenistic worlds. Excavations have revealed traces of long-term occupation stretching across multiple periods, including settlements associated with Bronze Age trade networks and later classical influences. Among the most intriguing remains are temple structures, whose stone foundations still rise from the island's surface, yet not in their original form. Time, salt air, and fire have altered them. Some walls appear heavily weathered, their surfaces darkened in a way that makes them stand apart from other regional ruins. These are often referred to, informally, as the Blackened temples of Failaka. At first glance, the darkened appearance might seem like a simple result of natural aging or environmental exposure. The island's climate, combined with centuries of abandonment and occasional reoccupation, has subjected its stone architecture to heat, salt, and wind. But in certain areas, the discoloration appears uneven, concentrated, and persistent, raising questions about whether natural weathering alone fully explains what is visible today. What happened here? Mainstream archaeological interpretations emphasize a combination of factors. Failaka's temples were used, rebuilt, and repurposed across different cultural phases. Fires, whether accidental, ritual, or destructive, may have contributed to localized scorching. Later periods of abandonment would have allowed natural processes to accelerate the darkening of exposed surfaces. In this view, the blackened appearance is not the result of a single event, but a cumulative history of use, damage, and environmental exposure. Yet even within this explanation, some details resist easy closure. Why do certain structural sections show more intense darkening than others, even when exposed to similar conditions? Why do some temple areas appear to have been carefully preserved or rebuilt after damage, while others were left to decay in place? And why does the spatial arrangement of fire-affected zones not always align neatly with patterns of known architectural collapse or environmental stress? These questions have led researchers to consider broader possibilities. One interpretation suggests that fire played a more central role in the island's ritual life than the remaining material record fully reveals. In many ancient cultures of the Gulf and Mesopotamian world, fire was not only destructive but also symbolic, associated with purification, renewal, and divine presence. If rituals involving controlled burning took place within temple spaces, repeated over generations, they may have gradually altered the appearance of stone surfaces in ways that are difficult to distinguish from environmental effects alone. Other interpretations focus on the island's shifting occupation history. Failaka was never static. It was repeatedly inhabited, abandoned, and re-inhabited by different cultural groups over time. Each phase may have left its own architectural imprint, including reconstruction, modification, and reuse of earlier sacred spaces. In this layered context, what appears as a single blackened temple may in fact be the accumulated result of multiple historical moments overlapping in the same physical space. There are also more speculative ideas that occasionally surface in discussions at the margins of mainstream archaeology. Some suggest that the darkened stone could reflect the remains of large-scale conflagrations tied to conflict or sudden abandonment events, moments when parts of the settlement were consumed by fire and never fully restored. Others propose that certain temples may have been deliberately left in a state of ruin, their blackened surfaces preserved as markers of memory, loss, or transformation. And so the question remains suspended in the coastal air of the Gulf. Are the blackened temples of Failaka the result of natural aging, repeated ritual fire, episodes of destruction, or a combination of forces that we have not yet fully learned how to separate in the archaeological record? In the vast sweep of Inner Mongolia, where the land stretches into rolling grasslands, arid plateaus, and wind-carved badlands, there are places where the earth itself seems to remember something older than memory. Long before modern borders or written chronicles, long before the rise of empires that would later map these regions with precision, there were only stone, dust, and the slow work of time. And beneath that silence, buried deep within sedimentary layers exposed by erosion and chance, strange remains began to surface. To the untrained eye, they looked like enormous bones. Fossils, weathered and heavy with age, sometimes so large that early villagers and herders could not easily reconcile them with anything known in the living world. Some were curved like massive ribs. Others resembled skull fragments, thick and ridged, as if belonging to creatures far beyond the scale of ordinary animals. In local tradition, they became known as dragon bones, a name that carried both awe and explanation, even if that explanation was not scientific. For centuries, such bones were collected, ground into powders in certain medicinal practices, or stored as curiosities. But in more recent times, as paleontology took root in the region, these same dragon bones began to reveal a different story, one not of mythology alone, but of deep prehistoric reality. Yet even as science began to classify them, questions lingered. Inner Mongolia is not a single landscape, but a mosaic of ancient environments. Some areas preserve evidence of prehistoric lakes, now vanished, where aquatic reptiles once moved through dense waters. Others reveal fossil beds embedded in sandstone, where wind and water buried entire ecosystems under fine layers of sediment, preserving fragments of life from millions of years ago. These are not quiet fossils in the ordinary sense. They are remnants of ecosystems so distant in time that they challenge the imagination. Among the most striking discoveries are large vertebrate fossils, some belonging to dinosaurs, others to prehistoric mammals whose forms do not always fit neatly into public understanding of natural history. In some cases, fragmentary remains have been misinterpreted or reinterpreted over time, shifting between categories as new techniques emerge and new comparisons are made. But the mystery is not simply what these bones are. It is also about how they were found, how they were interpreted, and what meaning people assigned to them long before modern science could offer answers. In certain locations across Inner Mongolia, fossils appear in dense concentrations, as if multiple large creatures were preserved in the same moment of geological catastrophe. Was it a sudden flood? A collapsing river system? A drying lake that trapped entire populations? Or something even more complex? A series of environmental changes unfolding over thousands of years, compressing time into layers that now seem almost simultaneous. The Earth does not label its events, it only preserves them. And yet, human interpretation always seeks narrative. For early observers, the idea of dragons was not merely fantasy. It was a framework through which the unknown could be understood. When massive bones emerged from the ground, bones far larger than those of any familiar animal, the dragon became a natural conclusion, a creature of power, of scale, of mythic presence. Later, as geological science expanded in the region, particularly through collaborative expeditions and fossil mapping, the dragon bones began to find classification: dinosaur fossils, prehistoric mammals, ancient reptiles. Each discovery seemed to resolve an old mystery, yet simultaneously revealed new gaps in understanding. How, for instance, do we account for the uneven distribution of certain fossil layers? Why do some deposits preserve delicate structures with extraordinary detail, while others nearby appear fragmented beyond recognition? Why do certain sites suggest rapid burial events, while others indicate slow, almost patient accumulation over time? And then there is the deeper question of perception itself. In some accounts from early collectors and local traditions, the bones were not simply remains. They were symbols, objects believed to carry healing properties or spiritual significance. Even after scientific reinterpretation, some of these beliefs did not vanish entirely. Instead, they adapted, existing alongside modern explanations rather than being fully replaced by them. This coexistence of frameworks, mythic and scientific, creates a layered narrative, one that does not easily resolve into a single answer. Modern paleontologists studying Inner Mongolia continue to uncover new species and revise old classifications. Some fossils once thought to belong to a single group are now split into multiple distinct lineages. Others, previously dismissed as fragmentary, are now recognized as key pieces in reconstructing entire prehistoric ecosystems. From the windswept fossil beds of Inner Mongolia, where ancient bones emerge like fragments of forgotten worlds, the story of deep time seems to stretch downward, layer upon layer of buried history waiting to be read. But there are places on Earth where the mystery does not lie beneath the ground. It is written across it. High in the Bolivian Altiplano, near the snow-capped silhouette of Nevado Sajama, the land opens into a vast, high-altitude desert. The air is thin here, the horizon unnervingly wide, and the silence so complete it feels almost structured, like something deliberately arranged rather than simply uninhabited. At first glance, it appears empty, a dry expanse of volcanic soil, scrubby vegetation, and wind-scoured earth stretching toward distant mountain ranges. And then, from above, or even from certain angles on the ground, an extraordinary pattern begins to reveal itself. Lines, thousands upon thousands of them, perfectly straight, astonishingly long, running across the desert floor like threads drawn by an invisible hand. Some extend for hundreds of meters, others for kilometers, intersecting, diverging, and forming a vast geometric web spread across the landscape. This is the region known for what researchers call the Sajama lines. Unlike the more widely known geoglyphs of other ancient cultures, these lines are not shaped into figures or symbols visible at ground level. Instead, they are carved pathways, narrow clearings where stones and surface debris have been carefully removed to expose the lighter soil beneath. From above, they form an intricate latticework across the desert plateau, a human-made geometry imposed upon one of the harshest environments in the world. But what purpose could such an immense and persistent pattern serve? Archaeological evidence suggests that these lines were created over centuries, possibly beginning more than 1,000 years ago and continuing into the period of pre-Columbian civilizations in the Andes. Local indigenous communities, including al-Marra speaking groups, are believed to have contributed to their formation. The construction method itself is deceptively simple. By walking repeated paths and clearing stones, generation after generation gradually inscribed the desert with enduring linear marks. Yet simplicity does not always equal clarity. Why would communities invest such sustained effort into creating a network of lines that, from the ground, appear almost indistinguishable from any other path? One widely accepted interpretation is that these lines served as ritual pilgrimage routes. In this view, they were not meant to be seen in the modern sense, but experienced, walked as part of spiritual journeys connecting sacred sites scattered across the Altiplano. The lines converge near water sources, ceremonial locations, and areas associated with ritual significance, suggesting a landscape deeply embedded with meaning. But even this explanation raises further questions. Why so many lines? Why such precision over such a vast area? And why maintain them across generations with such consistency, even in a landscape where survival itself demands constant adaptation? Looking across the plateau today, the geometry is still striking. From ground level, one might stand within a single line and see only a narrow path stretching ahead, disappearing into the dust. But from elevated viewpoints, the pattern becomes overwhelming, an almost abstract grid imposed upon natural terrain, defying the randomness one might expect from centuries of human movement. It invites a different kind of interpretation. Some researchers have suggested that the lines functioned as a complex communication system, connecting settlements and sacred sites across long distances. Others propose that they may have been aligned with astronomical observations, reflecting celestial cycles or solar orientations important to agricultural and ritual calendars in the Andes. And then there are more speculative ideas. Could the lines represent a form of symbolic mapping, an attempt not just to traverse the land, but to encode it? A way of organizing space that reflects cosmology rather than geography. In this interpretation, the desert becomes a kind of manuscript, its surface written not with ink, but with absence, the deliberate removal of stones creating meaning through contrast. There are even fringe theories that suggest something more abstract still, that the lines function as energy pathways, aligned with subtle natural forces perceived by ancient cultures, or that they were designed to guide not only human movement, but spiritual presence across the landscape. While these ideas sit outside mainstream archaeology, they persist in discussions about the Sajama lines, reflecting how deeply the pattern captures the imagination. What is undeniable, however, is the scale. The network covers hundreds of square kilometers. It is not a single construction event, nor the work of a single generation. It is cumulative, layered, and persistent, an evolving inscription across centuries of human presence in one of the most extreme environments on Earth. And yet, despite its scale, it remains subtle. It does not dominate the landscape in the way monumental architecture does. Instead, it blends into it, revealing itself only under certain conditions of light, elevation, and perspective. It is a pattern that seems designed not for immediate recognition, but for discovery. This raises a quiet and unsettling question. Was visibility ever the goal? Or were these lines meant to exist primarily as action? Paths walked, rituals performed, journeys repeated, rather than as images to be viewed from above. Modern aerial imaging has transformed how we understand the Sajama lines, allowing researchers to map their full extent for the first time. What once appeared as isolated paths now reveals itself as a continuous system, integrated into the broader sacred geography of the Andes. Yet even with this technological clarity, interpretation remains elusive. The more we map, the more questions emerge. Why do some lines terminate abruptly while others continue for kilometers without interruption? Why do certain intersections cluster around specific environmental features? And why does the pattern feel, at times, almost deliberate in its refusal to resolve into a single coherent design? Standing in the middle of this high-altitude desert, surrounded by silence and thin air, it is difficult not to feel the presence of intention, though intention of what kind remains uncertain. Ritual, navigation, communication, cosmology, or something that does not fit neatly into any modern category. The Earth here does not preserve bones or ruins in the way buried sites do. Instead, it preserves movement, the trace of footsteps repeated across generations until they become geometry. And perhaps that is what makes the Sajama lines so difficult to fully understand. They are not an object to be studied, but an action made permanent. Even now, as satellite images continue to refine our understanding of their structure, the deeper meaning remains just out of reach, as if the landscape is offering only the outline of an answer, while withholding the rest. What did those who walked these lines see when they looked across this vast desert? And what, if anything, were they trying to leave behind for those who would eventually see it from above, centuries later, with entirely different eyes? The pattern is still there, patient, expansive, unfinished in its explanation, and the question remains suspended over the altiplano like the thin mountain air itself. What exactly is written across this desert that we are only now beginning to learn how to read? From the high, wind-cut deserts of the Bolivian altiplano, where the earth itself appears inscribed with ancient movement in the form of the Sajama lines, the narrative of human presence does not fade. It shifts. It travels northward along the spine of the Andes, following the slow rise and fall of mountains, the deep valleys carved by water and time. And there, in northern Peru, where the Zanya Valley opens between arid hills and seasonal riverbeds, another kind of trace begins to appear, not drawn across the surface like lines in the desert, but built into it. At first glance, the landscape around Nanchoc seems unremarkable. Dry slopes, scattered vegetation, and the muted colors of a valley shaped by long cycles of drought and brief seasonal renewal. Yet beneath this quiet terrain lies one of the most intriguing early chapters of human settlement in the Andes. Here, archaeologists have uncovered what are often described as some of the earliest known agricultural landscapes in the Americas, dating back as far as 10,000 to 7,000 BC. Among the findings are stone structures, low platforms, terraces, and constructed surfaces, carefully arranged along the natural contours of the valley. They are not monumental in the way later civilizations would build. There are no towering temples or grand plazas. Instead, there is something more subtle, more foundational. Stone laid upon stone, forming leveled surfaces that seem to negotiate between human intention and the irregularity of the land itself. What were these platforms? In mainstream archaeological interpretation, many of them are understood as early agricultural installations or domestic foundations. The region shows some of the earliest evidence of plant domestication in the Americas, including crops such as squash and peanuts. Associated with these botanical remains are irrigation channels and water management systems, suggesting that the people of Nanchoc were not merely foraging, but actively shaping their environment in systematic ways. The stone platforms may have supported dwellings, storage areas, or cultivated plots elevated to manage water flow and soil conditions. In a valley defined by seasonal scarcity, even small modifications to the terrain could have had profound implications for survival. And yet, when these structures are viewed collectively, another impression begins to form. They are not isolated features. They are part of a pattern. Across the valley, clusters of stone platforms appear in relation to one another, often aligned with subtle shifts in elevation, proximity to ancient water channels, or positions that maximize visibility across the landscape. Some are simple, others more complex, but together they suggest a deliberate shaping of space that goes beyond immediate utility. Why invest such effort into leveling stone in an environment where every resource, every movement of water, every patch of fertile soil was already precious? And why do some of these platforms appear in locations that seem, at first glance, less suited for habitation or agriculture than nearby alternatives? Here, interpretation begins to widen. One perspective holds that these platforms represent the earliest stages of sedentary life in the Andes, a transitional moment when mobile hunter-gatherer groups began to anchor themselves more permanently to specific landscapes. In this view, the stone platforms are practical innovations, foundations for living, working, and cultivating in a challenging environment. But the Nanchoc evidence also raises deeper questions about how space itself was understood. The alignment of certain platforms suggests attention not only to environmental efficiency, but possibly to social or symbolic organization. Some researchers have proposed that these early constructions may reflect emerging forms of territorial identity, ways of marking presence in a landscape that was still being actively learned and defined. Others suggest that water management may have carried meanings beyond the purely functional. In a region where seasonal rivers could appear and disappear with little warning, controlling or guiding water might have held ritual significance as much as agricultural value. The platforms then could represent not just infrastructure, but participation in a broader cosmological relationship with land and water. And still, there are gaps. Archaeological layers in Nanchoc do not always present a continuous, easily readable sequence. Some areas show repeated rebuilding over time, with platforms modified, expanded, or abandoned. Others suggest sudden shifts in activity, as if patterns of occupation changed more rapidly than the material record can fully explain. What prompted these changes? Environmental fluctuation? Social transformation? Or something less visible in the archaeological record? Shifts in belief, organization, or cultural memory that do not leave clear material signatures? The further one examines the stone platforms, the more they seem to resist a single interpretation. They are at once practical and ambiguous, domestic and possibly ceremonial, structural and, in some sense, conceptual. And this duality invites a broader reflection. How do we distinguish between what was built for survival and what was built for meaning in societies that existed thousands of years before written language? Unlike later civilizations in the Andes, such as the Inca Empire, the people of Nanchoc left no textual records. There are no inscriptions to explain intent, no mythologies preserved in written form to clarify how these spaces were understood. Everything must be inferred from stone, soil, and the arrangement of space itself, which means that every interpretation remains, to some extent, provisional. Even the word platform carries assumptions, suggesting function, stability, and purpose. But what if some of these constructions were not single purpose at all? What if they changed meaning over time, serving different roles as generations passed, climates shifted, and communities reorganized their relationship with the valley? In this sense, Nanchoc is not just an archaeological site. It is a record of adaptation layered upon adaptation, where each stone structure may contain multiple histories rather than a single origin. And yet, despite decades of study, the full extent of the site's organization is still not entirely understood. The distribution of platforms across the valley does not always conform neatly to models of early agriculture or settlement development. There are patterns, but they are not always easily decoded. This leaves room for broader, more speculative possibilities, not as conclusions, but as questions. Could some of these platforms reflect early forms of social mapping, encoding relationships between groups rather than simply serving physical needs? Could they represent an early attempt to structure not just land use, but collective memory within a landscape still being domesticated? Or are we, perhaps, imposing coherence on what was originally a more fluid and evolving set of practices? Even the idea of early agriculture may be too narrow a frame to fully contain what was happening here. Because what emerges from Nanchoc is not just evidence of cultivation, but evidence of sustained engagement with place, an ongoing negotiation between human intention and environmental constraint, expressed through stone arrangements whose full logic remains partially out of reach. Standing in the valley today, one sees only fragments: low walls half absorbed by soil, platforms softened by centuries of erosion, faint outlines of structures that once held daily life. The wind moves across them without resistance, as if smoothing over the distinction between what is natural and what is constructed. And perhaps that is the final uncertainty they leave behind. Were these stone platforms simply the beginning of architecture in the Andes? Or are they something more complex? A record of early societies experimenting not only with building, but with the very idea of how space, survival, and meaning might be held together in a fragile landscape? The valley does not answer. It only preserves the question, waiting for the next layer of understanding to emerge. From the silent valley of Nanchoc, where early stone platforms trace the first hesitant geometry of settlement, the story of human presence continues to shift across continents and millennia. Each landscape seems to hold a different language of survival, some written in lines across deserts, others in terraces carved into valleys, and now, in the most unlikely places of all, in darkness itself. Far to the west, across mountains, arid plateaus, and the long corridors of time, lies the Judean desert, an austere, fractured landscape of limestone cliffs, deep wadis, and caves shaped by wind and erosion over thousands of years. It is a place where light feels temporary, where shadows cling to the rock long after the sun has moved on, and where silence is not empty, but layered. Within this desert, hidden within its limestone folds, something unexpected has been brought to light. Stone masks, not carved into temple walls, not displayed in open sanctuaries, but found buried, carefully placed within caves that once served as shelters, storage spaces, and in some cases, ritual environments used by prehistoric communities. These masks are among the most enigmatic artifacts associated with the early Neolithic cultures of the southern Levant, dating back to roughly 7000 BC. They are carved from stone, often limestone native to the region, and shaped into human-like faces. Eyes are hollowed, noses are carefully defined, mouths are sometimes indicated with subtle incisions, sometimes left blank, as if expression itself is suspended between presence and absence. And what makes them even more striking is not only their craftsmanship, but their context. Many were not found in habitation layers or open settlements, but in caves, some of which were deliberately sealed or used in ways that suggest ritual deposition rather than everyday utility. In certain cases, the masks appear to have been placed with care, as though their final position mattered as much as their creation. Why carve a face into stone and then hide it away in darkness? Mainstream archaeological interpretations suggest that these masks may have played a role in ancestral veneration or ritual practice. In early agricultural societies of the region, emerging social structures were often intertwined with spiritual frameworks. The masks could represent ancestors, spirits, or symbolic figures connected to community identity and continuity. They might have been used in ceremonies, then retired into caves as part of a ritual cycle. Objects that once held significance in performance or memory now return to the earth in a controlled act of closure. But even within this framework, the questions do not fully resolve. Some masks are remarkably uniform in their abstraction, while others display subtle individuality. High cheekbones, deeply set eyes, variations in proportion that suggest either intentional differentiation or perhaps the representation of distinct figures. Are these stylized humans, idealized forms, or something more complex, attempts to capture not physical likeness, but presence itself? The caves in which they were found add another layer of ambiguity. The Judean desert has long been known for its role as a refuge landscape. Across different periods, from prehistoric communities to later historical groups, caves served as places of concealment, storage, and survival. Yet these particular deposits of masks do not always align with purely practical use. In some instances, the objects appear arranged rather than discarded, as if participating in a structured act of placement. And then there is the broader cultural context. During the Neolithic period in the region, societies were undergoing profound transformation. Settlements were becoming more permanent. Agriculture was expanding. Social identities were shifting from mobile groups to more anchored communities tied to specific landscapes. In such moments of transition, material objects often take on heightened symbolic roles. The masks may therefore represent more than artistic expression. They may be part of a broader attempt to define identity in a changing world, where the boundaries between the living, the dead, and the remembered were actively negotiated. Still, interpretation is not straightforward. Some researchers have noted that the masks are too uniform in certain aspects to represent individualized portraiture in the modern sense, yet too varied to be purely standardized ritual objects. This tension raises a deeper question. Were they meant to represent actual people, archetypal figures, or conceptual beings understood within a belief system that no longer survives in recognizable form? And the caves themselves remain partially silent. Unlike open-air sites, cave environments preserve selectively. Organic materials decay differently. Human activity leaves traces that are fragmented, incomplete, and often disconnected from broader settlement patterns. What remains is a curated survival of material culture, objects that happened to endure, while others vanished without trace. So what we see may not be the full picture, but only a surviving fragment of a much larger system of meaning. There are also fringe interpretations that circulate at the edges of archaeological discourse. Some suggest that the masks could represent a form of early symbolic communication that predates structured religious systems as we understand them. Others propose that they may have been used in sensory or transformative rituals, where identity was temporarily worn or transferred between individuals and objects. These ideas remain speculative, but they reflect a persistent discomfort with how little the material record actually reveals about intention. Because intention is the most difficult thing to excavate. A carved face in stone tells us that someone chose to represent something human. But it does not tell us why. It does not tell us what happened in the cave after the carving was complete. It does not explain the moment when the mask was placed into darkness, away from daily life, into a space where time behaves differently. Standing in those caves today, some narrow, some expanding into deep chambers, it is possible to imagine how silence accumulates there, not as absence, but as presence without explanation. The stone walls hold faint traces of soot, mineral deposits, and occasional artifacts, but the meaning of the masks themselves remains suspended. Were they part of ceremonies meant to preserve memory? Were they tools of transformation, used in rituals that reshaped identity? Or were they offerings, given to spaces believed to hold forces beyond human comprehension? Even their placement raises questions that resist closure. Why caves? Why darkness? Why bury faces in places where they would no longer be seen? And perhaps most importantly, what did seeing mean to the people who created them? In a world where communities were redefining their relationship with land, ancestry, and survival, the act of carving a face into stone may have carried meanings that extend beyond portraiture. It may have been less about representation and more about anchoring something intangible, memory, presence, or belonging, into a permanent form. And yet, permanence itself is deceptive here, because even stone, over thousands of years, is subject to erosion, collapse, and concealment. What we call buried masks are not simply preserved objects. They are survivors of geological and human processes that have filtered the past into fragments we can only partially reconstruct. As more caves in the Judean desert continue to be studied, new discoveries may expand this collection, or they may deepen the mystery further, revealing variations that challenge even the current frameworks of interpretation. For now, the masks remain where they were found, silent, carved faces emerging from ancient darkness, their expressions unchanged across millennia, their purpose still unresolved. And as with so many traces left behind by early human societies, the question lingers not only in what they were, but in what kind of world made them possible in the first place. Somewhere in the stone, in the quiet of the caves, that answer may still be waiting, just beyond the reach of what has been uncovered so far. From the buried masks of the Judean desert, faces carved in stone and sealed within caves like silent witnesses to forgotten rites, the trail of human mystery moves again, this time northward, into the heart of Europe. Across the Carpathian Basin, where the Tisza River winds slowly through flatlands shaped by flood and time, there is a small Hungarian village, Tiszaszőlős. At first glance, it is unremarkable. Quiet agricultural land, low horizons, and the steady rhythm of rural life. But beneath its soil, something extraordinary was once uncovered. not a single artifact, not a solitary object lost and forgotten, but a hoard. A collection of objects so unusual in composition, so deliberate in arrangement, that it immediately raised questions that have never fully settled. The Tiszaszőlős hoard consists primarily of Bronze Age metal objects, tools, ornaments, fragments of weapons, and carefully worked pieces of bronze dating roughly to the late 2nd millennium BC, during the broader cultural horizon of the Urnfield culture. This was a time when communities across Central Europe were transitioning toward new forms of social organization, burial practices, and long-distance exchange networks. But what makes this hoard remarkable is not simply what it contains. It is how it appears to have been placed. Unlike typical buried assemblages associated with trade storage or ritual deposits, the objects in the Tiszaszőlős hoard were not simply discarded or hidden in haste. They were arranged in a way that suggests intention, layers of material positioned with a kind of internal logic that is not immediately explained by functional use. Some pieces are intact, others are broken in ways that do not appear random. Certain items seem selected not for their economic value alone, but for their form, their relationship to one another, or perhaps even their symbolic associations. Why would a community bury objects of bronze, materials that required significant labor, skill, and access to trade networks, in such a structured way, only to leave no clear trace of recovery? This question opens a broader window into the Bronze Age world of the Carpathian Basin, a landscape connected through rivers, seasonal routes, and emerging exchange systems that linked distant communities across what is now Hungary, Romania, and beyond. Bronze was not merely a material, it was a medium of transformation. Copper and tin brought together through knowledge that itself carried social prestige. Yet hoards like the one at Tiszaszőlős complicate the assumption that such objects were purely utilitarian or purely economic. Archaeologists have long debated the function of Bronze Age hoards in this region. Some interpret them as hidden wealth, materials stored for later retrieval during times of uncertainty. Others see them as ritual offerings, deliberately deposited into the earth as part of ceremonial acts, possibly linked to seasonal cycles, ancestor worship, or agreements with forces understood through belief systems no longer fully recoverable. The Tiszaszőlős hoard resists easy categorization between these interpretations. There are no clear signs of emergency, no evidence of sudden abandonment, destruction, or immediate return. Instead, the deposition appears structured, almost curated, as if the act of burial itself was the final purpose. And that raises a subtle but profound possibility, that the value of these objects may not have ended when they were placed underground. What if the act of deposition was itself a form of communication? Across Bronze Age Europe, hoards often appear in liminal spaces, riverbanks, wetlands, boundary zones between cultivated land and wilderness. These were not random choices. They suggest that the placement of objects in the earth may have been part of a broader worldview in which landscapes themselves were active participants in social and spiritual life. In the case of Tiszaszőlős, proximity to ancient water systems invites further reflection. Rivers in prehistoric Europe were not only resources, but pathways and thresholds. Depositing metal into such environments could have represented a gesture toward transition, an offering into movement itself, rather than static possession. But even this interpretation does not fully resolve the peculiar arrangement of the hoard. Some researchers have noted that certain fragments appear deliberately broken before deposition, while others were left intact. This pattern raises questions about whether destruction itself was part of the ritual process. Was breaking an object a way of activating its transition from human use to another domain of meaning? Or was it a method of redistribution, ensuring that no single item retained its original form or ownership? And then there is the broader silence surrounding its creators. Unlike later historical periods, there are no written records from the communities associated with the Urnfield culture that can directly explain the purpose of such deposits. Everything must be reconstructed from fragments, material traces, spatial patterns, and comparative analysis with other hoards across Europe. Yet even when compared, Tiszaszőlős remains unusual in its internal structure. It does not fully resemble hoards interpreted as emergency caches, nor does it perfectly match deposits widely understood as ritual foundation offerings. It sits somewhere between categories, resisting the taxonomies imposed by modern archaeology. And that resistance is itself part of the mystery, because classification often assumes that ancient behavior fits within stable, recognizable patterns. But the archaeological record repeatedly shows variability, practices that shift across time, region, and social context in ways that defy simple explanation. Some fringe interpretations suggest that hoards like Tiszaszőlős may have been part of more complex cosmological systems, in which objects were not merely given to the earth, but transformed through burial into agents of continuity between worlds. In this view, metal was not inert material. It was active, charged with meaning that changed when removed from circulation and placed into the ground. Others propose that such deposits could reflect social agreements encoded materially rather than verbally, acts of collective participation that reinforced relationships between groups, territories, or seasonal cycles. The hoard, then, would not be an endpoint, but a node in a broader network of interaction between people and landscape. Yet none of these interpretations can be definitively proven. What remains is the object itself, carefully arranged bronze, buried in a specific place, at a specific time, by people whose motivations we can only reconstruct indirectly. Standing in the quiet fields of modern Tiszaszőlős today, there is little to suggest the presence of such complexity beneath the soil. The land appears calm, ordered, and agricultural. But beneath its surface lies a different tempo of history, one that moves through accumulation, concealment, and disappearance. Every fragment recovered from the hoard is a clue, but also a limit. It tells us what was present, but not why it was arranged in that way. It shows us action, but not intention. And so the question remains suspended, like so many others across the archaeological record. Were these objects hidden for safety, for ritual, or for something that no longer fits neatly into either category? Or was the act of burying them itself the true meaning, an intentional gesture directed not toward retrieval, but toward transformation? The soil of the Carpathian Basin holds its answer tightly, and for now, it offers only fragments in return. Enough to know something was placed there, not enough to know why. And perhaps that is where the mystery continues to breathe.